Okay, hi everyone. I am Katrina Manigan. I lead the Buildings and Homes team in Denver's Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I will just be doing a briefing on the recommendations of the Energize Denver Task Force for our community. The task force released their recommendations in early September. There were some news articles on them. They are posted on the website. So I will go ahead and just post the link to the task force website, and it has the history of all their meetings. You can download the full recommendations there, but for those who just wanted to have a walkthrough of what the task force has said, I wanted to go ahead and we wanted to do this presentation to really make sure that our community understands what the task force has recommended. And I am going to just make Maria Thompson, who is on my team. She will be leading a lot of the implementation of the ordinance. We'll be building a whole team to lead implementation, but she's doing a lot of the initial work on implementation. So I'm going to make her one of the co-hosts so that she can help us manage the chat. Please feel free to put any questions in the chat in the question and answer. We want this to be a session that is really useful for all of you. So with that, I will just dive in. I have, a whole presentation to walk through the task force's process, their recommendations, and our plans for implementation. And so this is just a briefing on what the task force has recommended to the city. So here we go. Okay. Let me go ahead and pull the chat up on my screen also, just in case. Then I can see if folks have questions. So the Energize Denver Task Force, I'll go through, as I said, some background information and about the origin of the task force and the city, sort of the work in the city leading up to it, the policy development process the task force went through, and then the policy recommendations, as well as the incentive and support and other implementation recommendations from the task force. So we'll start with background and process. Commercial and multifamily buildings account for 49% of Denver's greenhouse gas emissions. And of these, there's 3,000 buildings that are over 25,000 square feet. This is 82% of the square footage of Denver are these larger buildings. And then there's a lot of small buildings. There are 14,000 buildings that are under 25,000 square feet. All of the buildings over 25,000 square feet have been benchmarking since 2016.
Hey, Katrina.
Yeah.
Not to cut you off, but we're seeing like the presentation view, not the.
Oh, that's strange. Okay, yeah. Thank you. Let's try it again. I wonder why it would do that. How about I just share? Is that better?
It's the same. It's showing the same thing, the presenter screen.
How about now?
That's good.
All right. I somehow had my screen switched. Thank you. Okay. So all buildings over 25,000 square feet have been benchmarking since 2016. We have 5 years of data now about the energy performance of all the larger buildings in Denver. You can go see information about their energy performance at energizedenver.org. our benchmarking data has told us that our buildings are currently using more energy every year. Our current trajectory would actually be that total building energy usage for commercial and multifamily buildings would go up by 2030, when our goal is to reduce energy usage 30% by 2030. This is in part driven by the addition of new buildings. We add about 2% of buildings to our building stock every year, but even just the existing buildings are just about level in any given year. Let me close my door because my dog barked. My apologies. Okay, so we know that we're off track from our goal. The Climate Action Task Force met in 2020, and they made a whole set of recommendations to the city about how we solve climate change. And one of their key recommendations was that we implement a building performance policy, including strategic electrification, so buildings achieve net zero energy by 2040. And that we equitably enhance affordable housing incentives, low-income programs, and really promote equity through this work. Here you can see other cities that have building performance policies across the country. This cities in orange are cities with a building performance policy already, and cities in blue are those that are working on it. Boston actually just passed their building performance policy this week. Or last week, it was approved by Boston City Council. So that's now an orange dot on the map. The city formed the Energize Denver Task Force back in December and January, or January of this year, and December the year before, to help us design a building performance policy for existing buildings to improve health and equity, create jobs, and drive climate solutions in buildings. So we know buildings are responsible for 49% of the greenhouse gas emissions today, and we tasked the task force with designing a policy to require existing buildings to achieve net zero energy by 2040. The Energize Denver Task Force was focused only on existing commercial and multifamily buildings, not single family homes. And the city's definition of net zero energy is that a building is highly energy efficient, all electric, using renewable energy, and a provider of demand flexibility for the grid. Renewable energy, I'll note within this definition, doesn't need to be on every single building. Our grid will be 80% renewable by 2030. And so we are looking for buildings to contribute some to closing that gap to be 100% renewable by 2030, but we are relying on the grid to achieve this renewable energy in many ways. Here's the goal of the task force laid out in chart form. You can see that the open bars are the cumulative greenhouse gas emission reduction goal that we set for the task force. I saw a request for a link to the report in the chat. Maybe Maria can drop that in again. I had put it in the chat earlier, but perhaps that person joined after I loaded the link to the actual report in the chat, or the actual recommendations. So the cumulative goal here is the open bars to reduce blue, the electricity carbon emissions, and yellow, the fossil gas or natural gas carbon emissions to zero by 2040. Here are the Energize Denver Task Force members. And this group was really diverse with building owners and managers, our local utility, oil energy providers, resident, tenant, nonprofit representatives, labor and workforce representatives, environment and clean energy representatives, Councilman Jolan Clark from City Council, 25 individuals here. It was 40% people of color on the task force, and we challenged them to reach consensus around one set of recommendations to us. And that's what I'll be presenting to you today, is what their consensus recommendations were to the city. Here was their schedule. They started with meeting one in January, and they met once a month through August to work on how to kind of ground all of this work in improving equity and how to review approaches and resources to shape the process. And they finished their work in August with kind of a final conversation, reviewing all their community engagement and community input and talking about how it all comes together. So there were 8 task force meetings. There were many working group meetings and side meetings along the way. And I'll review what they heard from their community engagement the last couple weeks of July also, as they got community input on their process. Here's what the task force said they wanted to achieve together. These were some guiding principles for their work that they said before we even started the process. This is what we heard in their background interviews before we kicked off task force work, that they want this to be achievable for all building owners. They want it to actually improve equity, be people-centered, implementable, effective, flexible. They spent their whole second meeting focused on developing this racial equity lens and spent a lot of time with an equity trainer talking about how this is a goal. They had a goal to keep this lens on at all times, more like LASIK than like glasses. And they talked about, does this process ensure that the voice of people of color is present, that the process is accessible, that the outcomes prioritize providing benefits and improving the lives of people of color. How is it going to be perceived by people of color? And they recommended a lot of, especially as we turn to implementation, a lot of outreach and community engagement. And does the policy worsen or ignore existing disparities? So not only can we provide benefits, but are we doing anything to worsen existing disparities? Or key questions. And they took that lens and sort of helped us map this onto a racial equity roadmap for the work. They, you can see kind of the process with the city challenged them in orange with how can net zero energy advance racial equity. And then in each stage of their process, they sort of focused on which were the most relevant equity lens questions and how can they actually have indicators or metrics, which you'll see at the bottom, for those questions. So if we're going to talk about providing benefit to people of color, then how could that be quantified in terms of reduced energy burden or improved housing quality? If we're going to avoid unintended consequences to people of color, how can we make sure and monitor for how this might increase housing costs or displacement? If we're talking about benefits of people of color from renewable heating and cooling or electrification, how can we make sure people are getting safer spaces with less carbon monoxide? How can we measure that lower exposure to indoor air pollutants? So they really looked at the metrics and they challenged us as we implement to also be looking at these metrics as we go. I will note, just in terms of kind of the process, the state was working to develop a building performance policy at the same time. This is the bill that passed through the State House this session, and it directs the state to run a task force that will develop a performance standard statewide to achieve a minimum 7% greenhouse gas savings by 2026 and 20% savings by 2030. That task force meets for the first time later today to begin developing the state standards. I know I will be one of the task force members. I know there will be a number of other task force members who are going to be focused on making sure that for building owners, there aren't two very kind of different policies, that these two things sync up so that it is easy and we have that sort of easy achievable compliance for building owners and managers. The last thing I'll mention just on process is the task force was really data driven in their process. They asked us to develop this policy design tool, and it let the task force actually turn on and off different policy options for different building sizes, different types, to see if they're reaching their carbon budget and how they're doing around cost effectiveness and implementability and impact of the policy. So here's a screenshot of how that tool worked. You can see the policy inputs that they could adjust on the left. And the policy impacts on the right. Their goal was a cumulative emission reduction of 13.7 million metric tons of carbon reduced by 2040. And so then they turned on different policy options. And they ended up getting about 80% of the way to their goal. So they have made recommendations that achieve an 80% reduction, both cumulatively between now and 2040 and in 2040 itself, a 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from commercial and multifamily buildings. And so here's what the policies are that they recommended to the city that achieve that reduction. And I'll go through the specifics on these, as well as all the support and incentives and workforce training and implementation plans that we have. But I'll start just with walking through, like, what are the actual policies or requirements that they've recommended to us. They've recommended that we have an energy efficiency and renewable energy policy, where we require a 30% improvement in energy performance by 2030, as well as a renewable heating and cooling requirement that requires partial electrification upon system replacement when it's cost effective. And that's water and space heating systems.
Not to cut you off, but we had a quick question on the design, the policy design tool on the slide. We're just wondering who developed it and if it was publicly available.
Yeah, great question. We had Group 14 Engineering develop it through an on-call contract that the city has with them. We're happy to make it publicly available. Perhaps we should just load it on the website. I thought it was far too sort of weedy and wonky for the average person to want to download. But I think it might not be bad in case someone wants to go and find it. I think it is really a useful tool. So I will put it on the website, but I'll also, Maria, do you want to just drop my email in the chat? Because I'm happy to just share it with someone until we get it loaded up. We will be recording this presentation and putting the slides in this presentation also on the task force website with their final recommendations. Okay. Thanks, Maria. So here's the energy efficiency and renewable energy policy recommendations of the task force. They said that there should be a 30% improvement in energy performance by 2030, covers all buildings over 25,000 square feet. A long-term performance target is created for every individual building type, measured through energy use intensity, which is the kBTUs used per square foot. There would be required interim targets set for every individual building by drawing a straight line from the building's baseline EUI to the final EUI. And solar on-site would be fully credited toward energy use, directly lowering the building's energy use intensity. And there would be credit for high performers. So 15% of buildings that are already performing at that target energy use intensity for that building type don't need to take any further action. But here's what that looks like in chart form for an office building. For an office building, the target will be an energy use intensity of 50 kBTUs per square foot per year. Office A uses the most energy today. It uses 100 kBTUs per square foot per year. And so it has its own interim binding targets of 83 and 67, so that it has its own trajectory to get to the final target. This is based on sort of lessons learned from other jurisdictions, where some jurisdictions have set the same target for all buildings. And it's very hard for all buildings to hit the same target in 5 years. And so every building now has its own trajectory under this policy to reach the same final target. And again, 15% of the buildings are already performing better than that final target today. So here's what those targets would be for different building types. And that's based off of our 2019 benchmarking data. So this is based off actual data in Denver. And there are just some building types that use more energy, like a supermarket or grocery store, than other building types, such as a non-refrigerated warehouse or a distribution center. Those don't use very much energy, or a self-storage facility. So the target is different by building type. Here's what the 3-year compliance cycle looks like. In 2022, we will start communicating with building owners and managers, assuming all of this moves forward to actually be ordinance, to excuse me, to allow time for planning and budgeting improvements and start to tell people what they're going to have to do. In 2023 is when initial improvements need to be made. I would anticipate buildings would do it like kind of quick payback items, tune up the building, and start to determine if they need any of the alternate compliance pathways that I'll talk about in a moment, or if they can reach their 2024 target. 2024 is the compliance year. So energy usage from that year counts for compliance. And then they have to demonstrate that compliance when they report for benchmarking by June 1st of 2025. That's when 2024 data is reported. And that first compliance cycle, we are committed to fully support building owners and managers who don't reach their 2024 target to develop alternate plans to hit their next target. Our goal is not to be punitive. And the task force said, don't be punitive, like work with people to help them comply. And so here's some of those alternate compliance options if a building is not able to reach this individual or this first compliance target. They can request a different compliance timeline that is more cost effective or more feasible. And we are writing kind of the specific rules and regs based on this guidance. We're drafting those now. But the guidance from the task force was, if an affordable housing building needs to wait until it goes through refinancing, because that's when they can get capital to make improvements. Or if a furnace is going to go out, a rooftop unit furnace is going to go out in a few years or will reach end of system life, they might say, we're going to wait until end of system life because we know we can hit our performance target once we upgrade that system to a heat pump. Or if a major tenant is about to move out, there'll be a number of reasons why a building might need a different timeline. So they would have to submit an application for that other timeline. Alternate compliance option 2 would be to adjust the end goal. So if a building for some reason actually cannot hit the target energy use intensity for its building type because of inherent characteristics of that building or a big change in use, then we can adjust the final target. There will be a standard process for a building owner to go through to adjust their final target. And lastly, there'll be a prescriptive option for the smaller buildings if they electrify space and water heat and verify they have all LED lights, then that counts for compliance in 2024 and 2027. And that is just to help some of the smaller buildings, which tend to have less sophisticated ownership. If they just want to check a couple boxes and know what they have to do and not have to analyze how to get there, then they can do those prescriptive steps. There will also be an alternate compliance option for manufacturing or agriculture. For buildings where those activities are taking place. We will develop rules for that. And that's what the task force said, with input from those stakeholders. So those, that will be a process we'll run in the future to determine how they can still save that 30% by 2030 in a way that can work really well for those processes. Some of these are really energy intensive processes. It means there's a big opportunity for energy, for dollar savings if they can save energy, but we have to do something that works for these processes, and it will be much more custom to the kind of process that they have in the building. Small buildings, these are the buildings under 25,000 square feet. The task force said they should have to either do a lighting upgrade and make sure and verify with us they have all LED lights, or install and buy solar panels. And this starts a little bit later than the other building performance requirements, so that we have time to sort of gear up and implement this. It phases in over different sizes over time also, so that the very smallest buildings have the requirement phase in later for those that are under 10,000 square feet, and it just goes down to 5,000 square feet. Penalties, the task force gave us some general guidance that these fines should be higher than the cost of compliance. They should be higher for buildings that have an alternate compliance timeline. And we need to make sure that new owners know the compliance status of their building, so that if you buy a building in 2027, you know that where it's at in terms of compliance and what has been done, what still has to be done to meet the next target. Okay, now the renewable heating and cooling requirement recommendations from the task force. First, I want to just cover a little bit about why are we talking about renewable heating and cooling or electrification. So when we talk about electrifying space heat and water heat, we're talking about that because there's a really high impact climate benefit. You can see a chart on the right with the emissions on the grid. And there's an 80% reduction, 80% renewable grid by 2030 is what's planned by Xcel Energy. So as the grid moves to be 100% renewable, moving off of natural gas, fossil gas for space heat and water heat to this renewable electricity is the clear path to reduce that, create that big greenhouse gas emission. And methane, which is the primary component of natural gas, I'll note, is released when we use gas. And it has 80 times the carbon emissions or the climate impact as standard carbon dioxide emissions. So methane is this really potent greenhouse gas. Reducing methane is one of the highest impact near-term things we can do to address climate change. There's also really big equity and safety benefits. This is one of the ones the task force spent a lot of time focused on in terms of how we deliver equity benefits, because we know that 30 or even 40% of low-income homes in Denver today have gas equipment that fails carbon monoxide tests. And that's a really big safety issue, really big equity issue. It's true in a lot of this would be true in single family homes, which this task force was not focused on, but also all of the apartments that people rent where there's gas equipment in those apartments. There's a big carbon monoxide issue today with gas equipment. So replacing this with a heat pump gets a better outcome for the same cost. And I'll go through what the policy recommendation is, but again, the task force is recommending cost-effective things at near cost parity are what need to be replaced with electric systems. I'll note that grid utilization, you may wonder if the grid can support all of this heating, and it turns out Denver's electric system is, of course, built to withstand a high air conditioning load in the summer. We're a summer peaking system right now. So we studied this extensively, as has our utility, Xcel Energy, and a lot of winter heating needs can shift to renewable electricity without the need to significantly build out our grid further. It actually increases grid utilization. Okay, so with that, what did the task force recommend? They recommended that renewable heating and cooling be required with partial electrification upon system replacement when cost effective with this phasing. And I'll go through the details, but the first phase would be no requirements, but incentives for electrification, schematic design, or an electrification feasibility study is also what we're calling that. The second phase would be still no requirements, but we want to make the permitting ease equal. So we want to make the permitting process equal, because today it's harder to permit a heat pump system than a gas system. And we will start offering incentives for heat pumps for all buildings. And I will get more into the details of the incentives, but the incentives were really key to this phasing to get the market ready for requirements that start in 2025 or 2027 to replace heat pumps, replace gas systems with at least partially electric heat pump systems when cost effective, when economically feasible. So here's those easy to electrify system types where the requirements start in 2025. These are gas furnaces, rooftop units, individual water heating systems with a tank, and gas point of use water heating systems. We want these to be electric starting in 2025. Again, there would be exemptions for economic hardship, for emergency replacement, but these but the requirements would start for these. These are generally cost effective to electrify today, and so the requirements start first in 2025. These systems are much harder to electrify. They are not at cost parity very often today. They're also very custom systems. So in some buildings, it will be cost effective. So we have these start with requirements in 2027 for P-tax boilers, central hot water systems, with the hope that the technology has improved by then, but also understanding that if it has, if it hasn't, then more of these will qualify for like an economic hardship exemption, but they will have to start looking at, can they at least partially electrify? You can also often do heat pumps for part of these systems, but it may only be 50% instead of 80% electric. And then lastly, all water heaters need to be providers of demand flexibility to the grid. And this is the demand response protocol that is the standard way that now the grid building could enroll in a demand response program, and the hot water heater would adjust its demand based on the needs of the grid.
Katrina, we've got a few questions building in the chat, but one to what you're just talking about is how will cost effectiveness be evaluated, or how was it considered when developing these numbers?
Yeah, great question. And a lot of the exact details will have to be determined in the future, but the guidance the task force gave us was that systems that are nearly at cost parity should be required to electrify, and near cost parity should be including all incentives available for heat pumps from the utility, from ourselves, because we will be offering incentives, as well as including the social cost of carbon, which is the economic cost of the carbon emitted from a gas system. And they said that we need to study more exactly how to define that, but that it should fall within sort of 5 to 15%, no more than that, in terms of a cost increase over a like for like system replacement. So the sort of things that would get exemptions are like if you for some reason did need a panel upgrade, or if it's just a very expensive retrofit, because in some cases a heat pump can be very plug and play, and in other cases it requires a lot of re-engineering, and that's not what the task force intended to cover. And remember, this is all just space and water heat. So I saw a question about gas cooking, not covered by the task force. This is space heat and water heat only. So I'll talk about just how this all comes together, and then Maria, you can flag if there's other things that you think I should address now before we get into some of how we're going to support the community and have incentives for some of this. So the 2024 has the interim first performance target for 10% of total savings across the city. And then in yellow, you can see the first renewable heating and cooling requirements kick in for those easy to electrify system types in 2027. The second interim performance target happens, and there are some additional system types that have to partially electrify when cost effective. And then 2030, we will have the 30% energy savings, and electrification continues as systems are replaced. Any other questions you think I should cover now, Maria, before we go through support and incentives? If not, we'll make sure we have time to go back through questions at the end.
I think we can probably circle back at the end. There's a few that are kind of in different areas, so it probably makes sense to just cover at the end.
Great. Okay, so first we're going to develop a building resource hub that will tell everyone about all of our incentives, all of Excel's incentives, any federal or other incentives. We'll provide a lot of support and outreach to our community with targeted outreach and education. We'll have technical assistance available. We will do community engagement, have recognition and awards. There will be extra support for under-resourced buildings. The task force said we really need to focus on providing extra support for buildings in areas with a high social equity index score. And here you can see an example of a social equity index where we would, and we're developing this now, or weight different social equity indicators like utility burden, income stress, asthma rates, and put those together so that we are targeting extra support to those areas of the city. We'll also target all that extra support to buildings with affordable units or buildings that otherwise serve under-resourced communities. And they will get extra technical assistance in the form of a dedicated energy advisor and extra financial assistance in that the task force said we need to ensure that all of these buildings are at cost parity when they replace equipment and they have to partially electrify. So not near cost parity, at cost parity, and make sure all of our incentives start going towards under-resourced buildings once requirements begin for electrification. I'll cover a few more details about how incentive design will work. So we will be first incentivizing early action for all buildings with a focus on intensive outreach to under-resourced buildings, with our target being to spend 50% of incentive dollars in under-resourced buildings. And then the second phase, as requirements begin, we will just be focusing all of our incentive dollars on helping under-resourced buildings with compliance. And then eventually, we hope we can phase out the incentives as cost parity is achieved, at least for certain system types, and we can advocate for incentives from others also, and to make sure that our incentives at the city are complemented with incentive dollars from others. The task force said we need to set standards for our incentives to ensure that the city incentive dollars are supporting women and minority-owned businesses and high-road jobs with labor standards to do that. Here's an example of our incentives. We have a STEAM program today, and you can find that on our website, and it helps to pay for electrification of buildings on the STEAM loop today. There's financing programs available today through PACE and new programs coming through the Colorado Clean Energy Fund. And we will be rolling out additional incentives that we'll be going through the design process for now. We have a posting up now for a building decarbonization incentives manager. So if you know anyone who would be great at helping us administer and develop and design all these incentives, please tell them to apply quickly. We're nearing sort of the end of that application process for that first role to build that up. I want to just tell you a little bit about how the task force engaged the community in reviewing their recommendations. So after their 7th meeting and before their 8th meeting, the task force and the city together did a whole bunch of community engagement. So I hope a number of you participated in this. We had a technical briefing and an input session. There was a survey to collect all the input. We had a special discussion with industrial and manufacturing stakeholders. Individual task force members did a whole bunch of outreach to their memberships and the sectors they represent. And here's some of what we heard in the survey. We heard from Denver residents. Primarily, you could check multiple boxes. So I think a number of folks, like a Denver building owner or manager, were also Denver residents, probably engineers, tenant rights groups, environmental advocacy groups, some city employees who took this survey. And they told us, that the climate crisis is urgent, is very urgent. That the task force, what they said is actually the task force hadn't done enough to reach its goal. And at the time when they were giving this input, the task force hadn't made any recommendations for small buildings, for example. The task force really took this to heart and looked at how can they do more to get further towards their goal in a way that still seems really achievable for all buildings. And in their 8th meeting is when they added in those small building requirements. It got them another 1 million tons of cumulative savings. The task force, most folks were saying that the task force was on the right track to make this genuinely achievable for all building owners and managers, but some folks said, no, this is not feeling genuinely achievable. And I think that is also where the task force really added some more detailed recommendations on how we provide the support and the incentives to make this achievable for all building owners and managers, and especially for all those under-resourced buildings. So with that, I'll turn to how we're talking about implementation, what the task force recommended we do in terms of implementation. They recommended we provide workforce training to make sure we're getting equitable access into these clean energy jobs, because all of this work in buildings will create new jobs. So how do we give opportunities for people from under-resourced communities access to these jobs? And second, how do we develop upskill current workers? So we are going to offer training programs to really develop that pipeline of entry-level workers and upskill current workers. Next, we will be doing a lot of evaluation of implementation. They told us we have to ensure we have measurable outcomes, and using all the indicators and metrics, we'll develop the social equity index. We'll develop outreach to all those under-resourced buildings, develop the incentives and support, develop programs and tools to really prevent gentrification and displacement, or to monitor it and adjust if we need to based on it. If we are causing some of that, to do ongoing community outreach and really assess our progress based on racial equity. There will be a technical advisory committee. So I think I saw a note in the chat, how do I get involved? Could I join the task force? The task force's work is done, but this technical advisory committee will have a role in ongoing review and adjustment of targets, timelines, incentives, racial equity outcomes. And that they'll do a larger review every 4 years of changes in technology and compliance options. So assuming this all moves forward into ordinance, there will be this ongoing body that oversees its implementation. So I would encourage everyone to watch our list for the opportunity someday in the future, hopefully to apply to be part of this. The representation will be sort of a similar makeup to the task force, where we have a really diverse set of stakeholders helping us implement this ordinance. And lastly, the task force recommended we'll need a number of new city staff to implement the policy in our department, which is CASR, the Office of Climate Action, Sustainability and Resiliency, as well as in our partner agency, Community Planning and Development, who will be implementing the electrification permitting recommendations. Next steps will be, we are working kind of through internal city processes to bring an actual ordinance based on these recommendations to City Council. And then once that is passed, we would write rules and regulations. We'll start doing outreach. We'll start doing all that equitable incentive design. And that will start in parallel, honestly, with some of those earlier steps as soon as we have our new staff on board to begin running that work. We'll seat the technical advisory committee, stand up all the resources in the building resource hub, and then send some initial compliance notices sometime early next year if everything stays on schedule. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and turn to answering some of the questions. I saw a few questions, maybe I'll start with, and then I'll have Maria help me sort through the others. I saw a few questions about target energy use intensity for different building types. The targets the targets you saw in the table have been set based on our 2019 benchmarking data and are the actual targets. It will be a weather normalized target. So those are targets, the building's energy use that is reported to us in any given year will be weather normalized to see if they've hit that target, because of course energy use varies with weather in any given year. Maria, anything else that you think I should cover next?
Yeah, there's a few. I'll just go in the order they came in. We were talking about targets and like actual targets the buildings will have to meet. There's a question on who or what entity is awarding the energy credits, so maybe touch on just like how the targets will work and who will be enforcing them.
I'm not sure what that question meant by energy credits, but every building will be assigned a target energy use intensity, and they report that metric to us every year under our benchmarking ordinance already. And so they will have to report, and the building owner will be responsible for reporting energy performance to the city every year and demonstrating that they have reached the target energy performance for that building type. With that, feel free to add something back to the chat, whoever asked that, if that didn't answer your question.
There's also a question specifically related to affordable housing. Expectations to apply, will we be giving additional assistance, those types of things?
Yeah, so the task force wanted to make sure that affordable housing and other buildings serving under-resourced communities see the benefits of this ordinance. So we will be providing extra support to help those buildings comply, but we want to see them see the energy savings from the energy efficiency to reduce the energy burden. We want them to see those safety and health benefits from moving off of natural gas equipment. And so we will have extra technical support and extra financial support to help them with this compliance. But the task force actually felt like it was really important from an equity perspective to not have some sort of exemption or alternate path for them, because we want to make sure they're seeing these important equity benefits. Right, anything you want to add, Maria, feel free to add too if you're thinking of other stuff that we're going through these.
Yeah, good to know. There's another question too around the target EUIs, specifically, if it's weather normalized. And I think maybe it'd also be helpful to touch on, when we think we'll have those specific targets available and be communicating those.
Yeah, so we will write the target EUIs by building type into the rules and regulations. They will also, I think the actual ordinance will say that what someone has to meet is a weather normalized target EUI. So yes, they will be weather normalized. The reporting mechanism we use for benchmarking, which is the EPA's Energy Star Portfolio Manager tool, reports a weather normalized EUI already to us every year. And in terms of when we will tell building owners what their targets are, we will do that in 2022 for buildings that it's easy to know their targets because we have their 2019 benchmarking data and their building type is very clear. We'll notify them early, I think in 2022, in the first part of 2022, assuming everything moves forward sort of on the planned schedule, about what their final target is, as well as what their interim targets are. For some buildings, it may be somewhat more challenging because then we might not have 2019 benchmarking data for them, which is their baseline year. So we'll have to assign a baseline in another way. For some buildings, their building type may not be as clear, and we may need to get some more information from them to assign them a building type. And for those buildings, we commit by sort of mid to sort of third quarter of 2022 to make sure they know what their target is and what their requirements are.
And on that note, a question just came in regarding new construction and EUI targets and how that'll be managed.
Yeah, so new buildings will become existing buildings. They will, once they start reporting for benchmarking, which is when they become fully occupied, they have to report. They will then be told what the target is for that building type. They will have to achieve the target for whatever type building they are.
Awesome. And then also a question just around historic buildings and how we considered them and were built into the process.
Yeah, our benchmarking data doesn't show any correlation between building age and energy performance. A lot of old buildings actually perform quite well and will fall. Some of them may fall in that top 15% of buildings that don't need to do anything. We have seen, I'll note, a big jump in building performance very recently, sort of in the 2010s and beyond, because building energy codes got much stronger then. So to the new building question, the new building shouldn't have any trouble hitting these performance targets that were set for existing buildings based off of how our existing buildings are already performing. But they will have to manage to that and reach that. If a historic building for some reason was not able to reach the energy performance target for that building type, they would follow one of those alternate compliance pathways to apply for a different target or a different timeline. And so I think there will be some cases where the inherent characteristics of the building may make it impossible to reach or very hard to reach the assigned energy performance target, but that will mean that they take one of the alternate compliance pathways. And I don't actually expect that will fully correlate with building age because our benchmarking data does not show that historic buildings perform any worse.
There's a few questions too on incentives. Maybe we can switch that direction. I think generally just a question of like, how will incentives be funded? Do we anticipate the city funding or will it be utilities? Just some more information on that.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't cover that our office, as of last November, has the Climate Protection Fund, which voters approved for funding our office. It's a new sales tax that funds the work of our office to the tune of $35 to $40 million every year. So while we will be advocating for there to be more utility incentives for all of this, we also will be providing our own incentive dollars with Climate Protection Fund money. And the task force estimated that if we were going to support 5% of equipment installs for those easy to electrify equipment types in any given year, we would need to provide $16 million in incentives. And so that is the kind of order of magnitude that we are talking about, that we are designing for. That's why we're building a decarbonization incentives manager now, because we will have actual city incentive dollars. And we still need to design how those incentives will work. Will they be a rebate? Will they, like, what makes them really easy to access in the market and really usable? We will be going through a whole equitable incentive design process starting soon once we get someone on board to do that.
And on that note, there's like a specific question, just are we anticipating, providing subsidies on appliances or equipment bundles, particularly as it pertains to under-resourced communities, special negotiated prices for manufacturers, those types of things?
Yeah, the task force did recommend that we look at doing some bulk pricing work. That all has to still be designed and stood up. But we will be going through that equitable incentive design process to figure out what makes this, sort of how we can really maximize incentive dollars usefulness and application for under-resourced buildings. I noted one question that maybe I'll jump to, Maria, because I saw it asking if the energy use intensity targets are site or source. They are site energy use intensity targets.
I think one just came in on funding and training.
Yeah. Yes, that is part of our workforce training plan, is to provide training to upskill current workers to know more about how to install heat pumps and other efficient electric technology. So we're kind of going through a process to design that workforce training now. We had a workforce training RFP that included all the task force recommendations already open and have a number of responses back from providers already who want to start providing some of that training. And where there were gaps in sort of the responses we already got, we will be building out our sort of network to do the workforce training that's needed to sort of have people ready, both a pipeline of new workers and upskilling of current workers in this space. Great question just came in about restaurants. So again, nothing in the task force recommendations touches on anything except space and water heat. So everything about cooking is not covered by the task force. And that's because 97% of the natural gas used in commercial and multifamily buildings is for space and water heat. And so the task force did not address cooking in any way. So I don't expect there would be any regulations around cooking.
I think it'd also be helpful to touch on, there's been a few questions on like the materials, the presentation slides and the recordings. Will we be able to send those out to panelists, or can we put them on the website?
Yeah, so this is being recorded. We will post the recording as well as the slides on the Energize Denver Task Force website. I saw a question about if we can send those to all participants. We can do that. I can download everyone who signed up and who participated, and we will send you the recording and the slides and the task force recommendations if you were here today. Okay, did we get through all of them, Maria?
I think so. I missed any. Someone go ahead and put them in the chat real quick, and we can hopefully answer.
Okay, and while we look for any final bits, thank you all so much for your interest in the task force's work. I hope this was all clear. I know we have a big diversity in this audience. I've seen some names of people that are highly expert engineers, and others I think are just community members. So I hope this presentation was useful to all of you to just help you understand what the Energize Denver Task Force has recommended to the city. And yeah, we're really looking forward to moving forward with their recommendations.
Oh, there's a quick question on when new buildings will be required to be electric.
Great. So for new buildings, that was not the focus of the Energize Denver Task Force. We do have a new building net zero implementation plan. Maybe Maria can drop that in the chat. We also will be going through a code update next year. The applications close in the next couple days to apply to sit on one of Denver's code committees. So if you're interested in getting involved, you can follow and go and speak to different code proposals, as well as apply to sit on code committees. And we'll post that in the chat also. I'll go find the code committees right now, and we can send those as follow-up because I know this meeting will close out soon. But the new buildings will just be a separate process. They go through the code adoption process. Okay, here we go. I'll put this in there just for anyone that wants to grab it on the Denver building and fire code adoption process. I saw one other just question on costs about if this would be a large increase in project costs for HVAC contractors. Remember, the electrification requirements are only for projects that are cost effective. So this should not drive up costs. We are moving to better equipment for the same cost when we move to heat pumps. We did a whole renewable heating and cooling plan that I think Maria could also drop in the chat if folks are interested, that studied all the different heating and water heating systems in buildings and looked at the cost of each of those systems. And we found that quite a few systems can move to heat pumps without an increase in costs. So I'll just send you to that plan to look through which system types can be electrified, at least partially, without really increasing costs at all. And that's what the task force is intending with their requirements, is just to require that when it is cost effective to electrify, that buildings do so. When that is an economic hardship to electrify, or it is not cost effective, then the requirements would not apply, and there will be exemptions. Okay, on that note, thank you all again. I know we're just over time. Thanks for everyone's interest in the topic, and we'll go ahead and end the meeting.